In 1856, an early record of Chicago's founding said something no one expected. The first white man who settled here was a Negro. That line was not a mistake, and it was not a joke. It was a real sentence from one of the oldest accounts of Chicago's history. The man it described was Jean Baptiste Point DuSable, and he built the first permanent settlement on the land that became Chicago. He raised a family there, ran a trading empire there, and lived on that land for nearly 20 years before anyone else showed up. Then someone bought his house, stabbed the middleman to death, and had their family write a book calling themselves the Founder. For 150 years after DuSable died, the city of Chicago forgot the man who built it. This is how that happened. For most of its history, Chicago had one accepted answer to who founded the city, a fur trader from French Canada named John Kinzie. Kinzie arrived in the Chicago area in the early 1800s and quickly became one of the most well-known merchants across the Great Lakes. In 1856, his daughter-in-law Juliet Kinzie published a book called Wow Bun It Became the First Written History of Chicago. Wow Bun told readers that John Kinzie was the founding father of Chicago, and for 150 years, nobody questioned that. Today, there is a major street in downtown Chicago called Kinzie Street, and the family became one of the city's founding dynasties. The Encyclopedia Britannica later noted that Wow Bun was largely responsible for cementing Kinzie's reputation as Chicago's founder. But if you actually sit down and read Wow Bun carefully, you start to notice something that does not quite add up about the story. Kinzie did not build the house that sat on Chicago's North Bank. He purchased it in 1804 from a fur trader named Jean Lalime. And Lalime did not build that house either. He had purchased it 4 years earlier, in 1800, from somebody else entirely. Here is where it gets interesting. In that original 1800 sale document, John Kinzie himself was listed as a witness to the deal. He knew exactly who had sold that property to Lalime. The seller was a man named Jean Baptiste Point DuSable from Haiti. In all of Wow Bun, Juliet mentioned DuSable exactly one time. She called him Point O'Sable in a single sentence, then moved on. As for Lalime, the middleman who had purchased DuSable's entire estate, Kinzie stabbed him to death just 4 years later in 1804. That killing became known as Chicago's first murder. The buyer of the founder's house was killed by the man who bought it next. So Kinzie witnessed the original sale, then bought the property from the middleman, then killed the middleman shortly after that. And then his daughter-in-law sat down and wrote a book from inside that very same house, calling the Kinzie family Chicago's founders. There was one sentence Juliet could not completely erase. She admitted that before Kinzie, someone had made improvements there. She credited those improvements to a man she barely named, and here is the part of this story that really stays with you. Juliet Kinzie wrote those words while sitting inside the house that DuSable had built with his own hands decades earlier. So who was Jean Baptiste Point DuSable, and what exactly did he build on that swampy stretch of land by the shore of Lake Michigan? It was not just a house, it was an entire settlement with a trading post, livestock, workshops, and a family at the center of it. He built it on land that nobody else wanted, not the French, not the British, not the Spanish, and not the new American government. And it all started with a man born around 1,745 inches St. Mark on the island of Hispaniola, in what is the present-day nation of Haiti. His father was a French merchant, and his mother was an enslaved woman of African descent. DuSable grew up caught between two worlds. He spoke fluent French, English, and multiple indigenous languages. By every account, he was remarkably well educated for his era. Around 1770, DuSable arrived in New Orleans and then traveled north up the Mississippi River into the vast Illinois territory. The Great Lakes in the late 1700s were a contested borderland. Britain, France, Spain, and the new United States all claimed it. In that chaos, DuSable found his way to a marshy piece of land at the mouth of a river the Potawatomi people called Eshkagoo. Eshkagoo roughly translates to the land of the wild onion. It sat right where the Chicago River flows into Lake Michigan. Nobody wanted to settle there permanently, but DuSable saw what no one else could see: the crossroads of an entire continent. He stayed, and by the mid-1780s, he had built the first permanent settlement right on the north bank of the Chicago River. It was there that he met Kitihawa, a Potawatomi woman they married first in a tribal ceremony, then Catholic, at Cahokia in 1788. They had 2 children together, and in 1796, their granddaughter, Ulali, became the first non-Indigenous child born at Chicago. In 1779, British soldiers arrested DuSable during the Revolution. They suspected him of supporting the American Patriot cause. The British commander de Peyster wrote him down as a handsome Negro, well-educated and settled in Eshkagoo, the first record. That single line, written by a British officer, is the earliest known historical reference to anyone living permanently at Chicago. While DuSable sat in captivity, Kitihawa did not just wait. She ran the entire settlement alone, and then she did something else. She sent 3 bands of Ojibwe warriors to the British fort to demand her husband's release, and against all odds, it worked. The British freed DuSable and were so impressed by his standing that they made him manager of a trading post on the Street Clare River. By the late 1780s, DuSable was back in Chicago, and he had turned his settlement into the largest trading center in the whole region. His main house measured 40 by 22 feet, which was enormous by frontier standards, and it was no ordinary frontier cabin. Inside, he had fine furniture, and paintings on the walls outside stood a mill, bakehouse, smokehouse, dairy, stable, and barn. His estate inventory listed 30 cattle, 2 mules, and 44 chickens. This was not a homestead. It was a full enterprise. By 1790, the Encyclopedia Britannica records that DuSable's settlement had become an important link in the region's fur trade. He did business with indigenous nations, French voyageurs, British merchants, and American settlers, all from one piece of land. DuSable had built the first multicultural trading hub in what is now Chicago. Everything Kinzie later claimed was already there. All of it built from nothing, by one man, on a swamp that 4 different empires had looked at and decided was not worth settling. But the story does not end at its peak. On the 7th of May, 1800, DuSable sold his entire estate to a fur trader named Jean Lalime. The price was 6,000 livres, roughly $1,200 at the time, for everything he had spent 2 decades building. No one knows exactly why. He sold. Some historians point to grief after his son's death, others to rising pressure on free blacks. The man who signed as witness on that sale was John Kinzie. He saw the full inventory. He knew what the property was truly worth. DuSable left Chicago for Street Charles, Missouri, with nothing. And on the 28th of August, 1818, he died there completely penniless. He was buried in a Catholic cemetery in Street Charles, with no headstone, no marker, and no record of the exact plot location. The man who founded a city of 2.7 million people with a GDP over $700 billion lies in a grave nobody can find. Now put these 2 stories side by side and see what history chose to remember and what it chose to throw away for a century and a half. DuSable arrived at an empty swamp, built everything from nothing, lived there 20 years, created a home and a trading network. Kinzie showed up in 1804, 4 years after DuSable had already left, and purchased another man's lifework secondhand from Lalime. DuSable sold it all for $1,200, moved away with nothing, died broke, and was erased from history for 150 years. Kinzie killed the middleman, moved into DuSable's house, and eventually his family published a book calling him Chicago's founder. In the first history book ever written about Chicago, written inside the house DuSable built, he received one single sentence. One man built it from nothing, and the other man bought it from a dead middleman, and history chose to remember the buyer. The land where DuSable built his settlement is now called Pioneer Court, sitting at 401 North Michigan Avenue on the Magnificent Mile. Over 30,000 people walk across Pioneer Court every single day. It is one of the most expensive strips of land in America. That property DuSable sold for $1,200 now holds the Tribune Tower, the Apple Store, and the Equitable Building. His original land stretched from the Chicago River to Chicago Avenue and from State Street East to the lake worth billions now. A city of 2.7 million people with a GDP over $700 billion. All of it traces back to $1,200 and one man. In 2009, a bronze bust of DuSable was placed at Pioneer Court, donated by a Haitian American who wanted the founder remembered. Most of the 30,000 people who pass that bust every day have absolutely no idea whose land they are standing on right now. So how does a city manage to erase the man who founded it? How does that happen, and how does it last 150 years? After DuSable sold his land in 1800, the U.S. Army built Fort Dearborn across the river and a wave of white settlers arrived. They needed an origin story that matched them, and 19th century America only had one template: white pioneers on the frontier. A black man from Haiti who built a trading empire on a swamp did not fit that story, not even close, not in that century. The Kinzie family had political power and social connections, and Juliet had the education and the platform to write and publish. DuSable left behind no diary, no letters, no written account in his own words. Whoever writes the history controls the memory. Juliet Kinzie controlled Chicago's founding memory from inside the very house that the real founder had built with his own hands. The result was that from 1818 until 1968, nearly 150 years, DuSable was virtually invisible in official history. Historian Courtney Joseph writes that DuSable and Kitihawa built the first thriving settlement, business, and network in Chicago. But their story, she says, was written out of history due to the ways that American history silences people of color's existence. The DuSable Heritage Association calls him Chicago's first settler, first entrepreneur, first developer, champion of multiculturalism. Every single one of those titles, first settler, first entrepreneur, first developer, belongs to DuSable and not to John Kinzie. DuSable waited 150 years to receive credit for what he built. John Kinzie received that credit almost immediately. The real question is not just about who founded Chicago, it is about who gets the power to decide what history remembers. But the erasure did not go completely unchallenged. People fought back, and they fought for a very long time to set things right. In 1913, Chicago put up its first small plaque honoring DuSable, but most residents had never heard his name and walked right past. In 1933, a group of black women teachers and librarians led by Annie Oliver petitioned for a DuSable exhibit at the fair. The organizers approved it 2 weeks before opening day, 2 weeks to build a cabin replica and present an entire hidden history. They pulled it off, and the DuSable exhibit became one of the most popular attractions at the fair. Nobody had expected that. Those women founded the National DuSable Memorial Society and launched what became a 90-year campaign to restore the truth. 1936 brought DuSable High School in Bronzeville. 1961 brought Margaret Burroughs, founding what became the DuSable Museum, and in 1968, exactly 150 years after DuSable died penniless, Chicago finally recognized him as the city's founder. 1976. His home site became a National Historic Landmark. 1987. The Postal Service put his face on a 22-cent stamp. In 2006, the City Council amended the municipal code to formally list DuSable as founder. That was 188 years after his death. 2009. The bronze bust at Pioneer Court. 2010, the Michigan Avenue Bridge was officially renamed the DuSable Bridge over the river. Then came 2021, and the biggest fight of all, a proposal to rename Lakeshore Drive after Jean Baptiste Point DuSable. Alderman Moore said it plainly, "None of us would be here, including Lakeshore Drive, if this city was not founded by DuSable." The council voted 33-15, but every no vote came from white or Latino aldermen, splitting almost perfectly on race. The mayor had previously proposed spending $40 million on statues and a park as an alternative just to avoid the rename. Even in 2021, putting a black man's name on a road in the city he founded 200 years earlier was still a political fight. DuSable Park, 3 acres of lakefront land, was announced in 1987, delayed for nearly 40 years, and broke ground in 2024. But his actual grave sits somewhere in Street Charles, Missouri, in an unmarked plot that no historian has ever been able to locate. How many other founders are out there right now, buried under stories that someone else wrote, people we have never even heard of? If you know another forgotten founder, someone history tried to erase, put their name in the comments, let's bring them back. Subscribe if you want more hidden history that the textbooks decided to skip, because there is a whole lot more left to uncover. Next time we visit a hospital on the south side of Chicago, where a black surgeon attempted a procedure no doctor had ever tried.